I'd like to thank the organisers of this fantastic conference for inviting me to give you a little presentation on quality assurance and fungal diagnostics. There's a big difference between quality assurance and quality assessment, which I want to sort of highlight throughout my talk. So the contents I'll be covering is the laboratory itself, quality assurance, the total testing process, EQA, analytical and post-analytical errors, fungal diagnostics, and the conclusions. In the 19th century, health was transformed by clear, clean water. In the 21st century, health will be transformed by clean, clear knowledge. I took this on board thinking what we want to do is ask the requesting clinician what he actually wants to do when he has a patient, he has assessed the clinical status of the patient, what kind of test does he actually want to conduct and ask the laboratory to do. And on the other hand, we want the laboratory scientists, the healthcare scientists, to receive this information, be able to know how to interpret it and actually deliver the results that the requesting clinician wants to have. So what is the role of the laboratory? I know that you all know this all before, but I'm going to cover it again anyway. Laboratory services play a crucial role in both individual and population-based healthcare. And the prime objective of the laboratory is actually to report accurate and timely testing results to the requesting clinician. So we've got our laboratory tests. What do we use that to establish? The clinical status of the patient, diagnose infections and disease, monitor the progress and response to treatment. My first question to you is, what does quality assurance mean to you? Does it mean quality assessment of a clinical specimen, quality assurance of the results guaranteed, or is it quality accreditation of a clinical laboratory? It's not a test question. All of them. Now that is actually interesting. It's sort of true, but not true. Quality assurance definition is the total process by which the quality of the laboratory results can be guaranteed. So that's the whole process. It doesn't actually assess a result. That's a different component, part of the quality assurance. So it's quite nice to know that you've all got indicators that this is why you're doing the processes, implementing it into your laboratory. The reliability of the results is improved by undertaking components of the quality assurance system and thereby minimizing the variability of the results. Now, how do these variability arises? It comes from various biological analytical procedures, and as you all know, you do a lot of quantitative and qualitative processes which induces all these variabilities. So what are the components of quality assurance? Encompasses good laboratory practice, IQC, IQA, and more importantly, that's why it's a big circle, EQA, validation, evaluation of equipment, accreditation of your laboratory, auditing continuously throughout the processes, and you can't forget education. So these quality assurance components are adapted to the total testing process. The total testing process is actually a concept that was created by Lundberg 40 years ago, where he wanted to know what the brain of a clinician could translate the information to the brain of a laboratory scientist. And this concept was then adapted to the total testing process. So there are several stages that are in the TTP that can be assessed by the different components of quality assurance, and that is internal quality control, internal quality assessment, and of course EQA. At the moment, for UK NECWAS, EQA schemes are available to test and assess the analytical and the post-analytical procedures in the TTP. So what does the total testing process incorporate? The first stage, it starts with the patient, the clinical state of the patient. The doctor comes along and says, what do I want to actually request the laboratory to provide? And I thought with an example, we'll start with the BAL, which is quite a precious invasive specimen that a clinician will request alongside sputum to say, this is what I'd like to have taken from my patient. With the pre-analytical stage is when the samples, you're talking about transportation, the clinical details, the demographics. Pre-analytical is when it's actually received into the laboratory in those appropriate volume. Analytical is when you actually test the sample. Post-analytical is when it's reporting the sample, and post-analytical is when the clinician is interpreting the results. So I'll go through the different stages that I've just elaborated before. So the preparation of the patient, you'd need to know what kind of sample it is. So if it's a BAL, is a specimen, you've done a bronchial wash, you've got your 50 mils collected, do you take the right specimen, the volume, to the laboratory? The transportation, does it get promptly delivered to the laboratory so it gets investigated? And as you can see with the changes with the hospitals where there's the hub and the spoke, transportation would be an issue. If it's just up the second floor to get a BAL down, what are you going to do when the actual specimen's taken in a different hospital and it's actually tested in another one? And importantly, the date of request. So when you've got the BAL, you want to make sure, have you been given the right test to be delivered for this BAL? Has it asked for calcifluor? Has it asked for the culture and susceptibility? Is the volume right? Is the quality right? I understand from a speaker before that you actually dilute the BAL to make it more liquid. Would that affect all the tests that you're actually going to administer to this sample? And importantly, the demographics of the specimen. Is the clinical history appropriate for the sample that you've been given? And also the age. There's the age-old thing that if it comes late and the laboratory staff said, okay, it's my time's up, I'm going home, would it actually get processed? And we had a problem like that where working at the hospital at Royal Free, we used to get about 5 BALs come in all in one go at 5 o'clock on a Friday night. And in then, we didn't have the 24/7 shift system, so people go, oh God, so would we actually treat the specimen with kid gloves like you should do? Because it's such an invasive procedure, we wouldn't want to, have to ask for a repeat. And if it's a damaged, broken specimen, you wouldn't process it. So then you get to the analytical stage, which is processing the specimen, centrifugation and other processes that you need to make the specimen suitable for testing. Conventional testing, you've got your modern semi-automatic analytical systems now incorporated. This is especially good for identifying Candida species. You've also got your molecular techniques, which Lewis White and loads of other different researchers have advanced and sort of proclaimed that this is the best way forward. And then also you've got proteomics, and people are moving over to whole genome sequencing and next generation sequencing, but cost does have a big impact, and so at the moment it's restricted to the reference laboratory. Then it comes to post-analytical phase, and that's when you've got your sample and you need to report the results. Manual entering does cause a lot of problems, and so the implementation of automated systems like your WinPath and LIMS has helped that, and that's releasing the reports to the requesting clinician. And finally, the post-analytical stage is where the clinicians receive, interpret and react to the laboratory results in a timely manner to treat the patient promptly, interrupt combinations of markers for a definitive diagnosis, and administer appropriate treatment and monitor progress. So what are the errors that are associated with analytical errors? Get sample mix-up, inappropriate tests carried out, diagnostics tests performed incorrectly, automation failure, misidentification of the pathogen that you've isolated, and reporting a contaminant. And that is one of the things, if you've got an Aspergillus fumigatus isolated in a BAL, how significant is that? If it's only culture and it's not backed up by another fungal biomarker, how are you sure that it's not a contaminant? When it comes to post-analytical errors, I'm afraid to say, when we do receive reports from participants, there are quite a few post-analytical data errors. So you've done all that work, you've got a great result, and you put it in wrong. So, you either put it in, you mistake it and you put it in wrong, or you actually can have transposition error where you've missed one value for the next. So you send out a sample that might be critically high value, say for galactoman, and you've got 0.7, significant to say, okay, we've got to go forward and see what other tests we've got to provide. And if you say it's 0.5 or 0.49, you can think, oh, is it equivocal? Am I going to do it again? So the critical value and transposition error does always happen. It still happens today. And then there's the turnaround time. There's a paper by Rosemary Barnes in 2008 where she's stipulated that the delay of the delivery of the results to the requesting clinician does compound on the delay and is a risk factor to diagnosing a definite infection. You've done all the work, the lab's done all the work, but the actual registrar clinician fails to retrieve the result. And then you get the failure where you've actually fail to communicate the critical value, which is like the galactomannan that I've just mentioned previously. And then the provider misinterprets the lab result. So if you haven't got a good, solid knowledge of what the test actually involves and you misinterpret it, that has an impact on diagnosis. That's the same. So this is quite old data, but this is quite a leading author, Plebani, who does a lot of work on analytical errors. You can see here, you can't see it. Did I miss it? There you go, sorry, I've come back. You can see here that a lot of work has been done, a lot of work, and with all the previous speakers, where a lot of investigations have been done on the analytical investigations, all the fungal biomarkers, how you're going to improve it, and it's down to 13%, but that was in 2006. The huge errors are in the pre-analytical with the delivery of the specimen, where it's up to 68%, and the post-analytical. So you've done all the hard work, and you've just dropped down at the post-analytical. There's a failure there up to 47%. I'm sure with all the automated and implementation from manual to automation has helped reduce those errors. So what are the impact of these laboratory errors on the post-analytical phase? You get mismanagement of your patient, get misdiagnosis, there's incorrect and inappropriate treatment, delay or even a lack of treatment, and all these factors actually have an effect on patient care, causing actually 12% of potential harm. So, laboratories implement 3 complementary quality assurance components. And one of them is internal quality control, which we all know that when you're actually implementing a test, you do provide your own internal control. You can either have international standards or you produce your own material. And this is accepted levels predetermined at the validation stage of the equipment. What it doesn't do, it measures reproducibility, but not the accuracy of a result. Then you have the internal quality assessment, and that is when laboratories, if they're not participating in the EQA, if it's not available or they just choose not to participate in one, you anonymize the specimen, which is actually reintroduced back into the diagnostic laboratory process. And this actually monitors the operating is at an acceptable level. It monitors the performance of the laboratory staff if there's different staff performing the same test, and it monitors the consistency of the test procedures. But the limitation to this is that if you're going to introduce a specimen that you've already treated, would there be sufficient volume to actually get the same result? Say it was a BAL. One member of staff might actually treat it different from another one, so it's a good way to actually assess that. And the most importantly is the external quality assessment. And that's, as a UK Next provider, that is what I provide. And these are the benefits: interlaboratory comparability, it's standardized diagnostic testing, it compares laboratories' competence in testing to an external source. It's important, even while you carry out your own IQAs and your IQCs, it's always good to sort of have an undisclosed, unknown content being sent to you, so you have no idea what's in it, and you apply all your procedures and interpretations to actually find and assure, or assess actually, it's not assure, we assess that you've got the right answer. So these are the benefits. It actually maintains and improves analytical quality, initiate and evaluate corrective actions, improve interlaboratory agreement and raise standards, compare performance to analytical methods, review documentation and staff training, detect equipment faults, and identify reagent problems. Participating in an EQA, it actually tells you how well you're doing. It's not always what you're not doing right. It tells you that you've got a great performance. It reflects it in your cumulative performance. The best thing about an EQA is if you do have a discrepancy, you can go and find out why is there a non-conformance, and go down the path of a root cause analysis, you know, the 5 W's. Why, what, when, who, why. Was that right? I've missed out one W. So what are the most useful diagnostic tests for fungal diagnosis? I'm not going to go over all these again because all the prominent speakers of the last 2 days have actually emphasized the battery of fungal biomarkers that you have for invasive fungal diagnosis. They've all highlighted what the advantages are of each of these fungal biomarkers and what the limitations are. With conventional, which I'm old school, where I actually like looking at a fungus on a plate and seeing what it looks like phenotypically and seeing what the hyphae look like and what the colour is, reverse and front. Unfortunately, there's lots of experienced mycologists out there that do that kind of work, but they're all retiring or leaving, and so we're losing the expertise. We're actually getting an influx of a new pathogen causing a human fungal infection every month. So with these new organisms, how are they going to be identified? And so you have to move on to the newer technologies. Serology has always been present. It has its advantages and limitations again. It's not used as much. It's used for patients that actually have a poor immune response, so it's actually quite hard to actually, have they raised enough antibodies to actually react to the EIA that you've subjected to? One of the advantages for EIAs in coccidiomycosis in patients who are unable to produce a spit is to do an antibody test. Then you have my favourite, and is talked about for the last 2 days, of the galactomannan. Now, the galactomannan has now been recently added to the guidelines, the OITC guidelines of 2008, to say it is a definitive biomarker to identify definitive invasive aspergillosis. It does have a lot of its problems, teething over the last 15 years, but at the moment there is no EQA. But that's been developing now in the pipeline. There's actually no EQA available by any of the providers, so I'm trying to see I'll be the first one to actually deliver this to all the laboratories that actually require that, mainly because you have a lot of limitations. There's lots of work that have been published by Lewis and his group, Samir and Gemma, about all the different storage conditions and how it affects it. I had a student who's done a little study on the stability of galactomannan in serum, and we found it to be quite consistent. It's published in the IBMS Gazette, and he found that the stability over the 3 temperatures is quite stable, but it is in its preliminary stages, and we'll be sending out the first pilot to all the interested laboratories when we send it out in March. Because of the turnaround time and the delay of the delivery of the specimen to the laboratory, you've got your point of care testing, which is the lateral flow device. And again, most of the speakers have spoken about how good it is, how rapid it is, how quick it is, and it's quite cheap. And we haven't got an EQA for Cryptococcus, mainly because there hasn't been any problems. There's no publications that they actually had a problem with the crag, but now that they've got a lateral flow device, now they've got more kits coming onto the market, it's a good way to assess to see whether you have lots of kits, are the laboratory actually achieving the correct result. Molecular diagnostics, I won't go into that because it's been covered thoroughly to say how it's sensitive and specific to different fungi, but the best thing about it is that it does help with taxonomy and phylogeny, because traditional testing might not be able to identify the new fungus that's come on board. Everybody knows about moldy toff, and it's very good for identifying Candida species. It's still in its sort of early days for Aspergillus species, even though there's been lots of work done on it. And one of the limitations, which I have done myself, is to say which part of the fungus, if you've actually grown it on culture, which part of the fungus do you actually test? Do you test the centre? Do you test the end where it's more hyphae and a few conidia, how old the actual organism is? So it's in early days for the filamentous fungi, but it's a very good database for the yeast. As we talked a lot about fungal diagnostic for invasive aspergillosis, and you know the battery of fungal biomarkers to define this organism, there's a paper by yourself, that Martin, that said, and I found this and I found it quite interesting, that you had covered, you tested on 78 BALs and looked at combination testing and found that with the 5 different biomarkers, which combination gave you the best sensitivity and specificity, and galactomannan and PCR gave you 100%. For patients that were proven and probable, were 95 to 98. Conventional testing gave very low sensitivity. Just to enhance on saying about combination testing, and the way forward with that is with PCP. They're the different tests that you can actually use. Qualitative PCR has a very good 99% predictive negative value, so you can actually say it isn't PCP, but then what would you go about saying that it is PCP? You'd still have to go and do your beta-D glucan. Even though you've got your combination testing, the clinician still relies on the clinical status of the patient and other radiological findings to actually make a definite diagnosis, because with PCP you can't actually tell whether it's colonization or a true infection. So what are the mycology EQA schemes that we provide? You guys must be participants of all of these anyway. Is the identification and susceptibility testing of yeast and molds, including dermatophytes, antibody testing for candidiasis and aspergillosis, antigen testing for cryptococcus is in the pipeline, DNA detection of aspergillus and candida, which is another one that we're developing, antifungal assays, and interpretive comments. Now, interpretive comments actually assesses the part where the clinician actually gets all the results and say, what shall we do with them? And it's actually open to clinicians, registrars, consultants, and to the laboratory scientists. So you'll get a clinical scenario, you get the choice or the chance to diagnose and say, what would you do with it? And then return the results. It's not a scored scheme, but it's just for you to gain interest and get to know what other people's discussion, whether you're all on the same page in the diagnosis of an infection. And it's not just for mycology, it's for all disciplines. So to assess the pre and post monitoring, which I showed you earlier, where there's quite a high error rate, there's a new EQA scheme that's in the pipeline. We're in its third stage of a pilot scheme, where it wants to assess all stages of the total testing process, right from the beginning of the receipt of the patient's sample, how it gets to the laboratory, when it's actually analysed, and when it's reported to the clinician, so that everybody can get a highlight of what other laboratories are doing. It's drummed up a lot of interest, but when it comes down to actually filling in the questionnaire, we tend to get a little bit fragmented, so we haven't got a big database to actually give you data to say how has it been analysed. So my conclusions are, invasive fungal disease remains a challenge in the clinical practice. Not one test is good enough, and they all have their limitations. Because they have their limitations, that is the reason why to actually practice all the processes in a quality assurance program, to implement IQA, IQC, and EQA importantly, because you actually need to use a combination of all the fungal biomarkers to make a definitive diagnosis. You can't just use one test on its own. Clinicians still rely on their clinical judgment and radiological investigations for diagnosing invasive fungal disease, but having the armamentarium of these fungal biomarkers actually helps the prognosis to be easier. And more importantly, if you've done all the work, you actually need to give the results in a timely manner and have the confidence to make the diagnosis. So EQA, participation in the EQA is the way forward. Thank you for listening.